So we saw a gap in the advocacy going on in gay rights organizations as well as sex offender law reform organizations. Most gay rights groups ignore anything that have to do with incarceration because it shows queer people in the negative light, and sex offender issues are particularly scary for them because gay people have been trying to avoid association with the sex offender label for the last 75 plus years, so they're not too excited about this. And newfound successes in gay marriage and other assimilation-focused rights, such as marriage or don't ask, don't tell, or adoption, they make it harder to convince gay rights groups and gay people that we still need to be wary of law enforcement in the ways that the government criminalizes us, because it still does happen quite a bit, as I'll talk about. The groups focused on sex offender law reform haven't been addressing queer issues specifically yet, and we know that creating alliances with queer groups and with sex offender reform groups is really important in making meaningful changes, and I think we know that we need all the allies we can get in doing this work. And the history of the registry is very intimately woven with the history of the criminalization of queer people, as I'll talk about, and I think that reinforces the idea that an alliance like that is really necessary. Whew, I'm catching my breath. So the sex offender registry started in 1947 in California. I mean, you guys probably know most of this, as a private registry for law enforcement, and the public registries weren't created until much later. And when the registry was created, it was largely used to track gay people who were arrested for various sex crimes, which were often consensual acts. Queer people, and especially gay men, were targeted for arrest and labeled as mentally ill, and often civilly committed to mental institutions. In America, sodomy laws have been around in various forms since the 1600s, and the more you delve into the history, the more you find that the contemporary sex offender registries have deeply rooted history in homophobia. And understanding and acknowledging the historical connections is really important in organizing gay rights groups, anti-incarceration groups, and sex offender reform groups to change the laws and public perceptions of sex offenders. So there's a very long and complex history about how queer people have been criminalized, which is more than I can detail in this presentation today, so I'll focus on just some of the ways that queer people have been and still are targeted for criminalization. There's a long, well-documented history of law enforcement entrapping queer people in prostitution busts and gay cruising stings. In Los Angeles, the LAPD created special vice squads in the 1950s where police officers would go undercover to find gay people and arrest them for soliciting sex, when really the LAPD were just poaching gay people from places where they knew that they met and socialized, such as bars or parks, and then slapped them with bogus charges. Many of the men ended up registering as sex offenders and had their arrests publicized in newspapers, losing their jobs, families, and often just ruining their lives entirely. This was tolerated and even encouraged by a very homophobic public at the time. And it was also a time that gay people were seen as dangerous security threats and traitors to the US, along with alleged communists. Gay men are still targeted in stings to this day, which I was actually pretty surprised to find out myself. In 2009, New York City Police Department was arresting gay men for prostitution in adult video stores, and here's an excerpt from a news story that kind of explains how clearly messed up it is. Robert Pinter, a 52-year-old gay man, was arrested for prostitution at the Blue Door in the East Village on October 10th. He said a young man, a 29-year-old undercover cop, who Pinter said looked even younger, cruised him in the store. He was charming and persistent, and we agreed to go home for consensual sex. But as we were leaving, he said, "I want to pay you $50. I didn't respond, but I thought it was strange, Pinter recounted. As the men left the store, Pinter said, a group of men who did not show police identification pushed him against the wall. I thought I'd been set up by a gang, he said. I asked them why they were doing this to me. I was totally clueless. They handcuffed me and said, why the F do you think we're arresting you? Loitering for the purpose of prostitution. So what they were doing was just finding these gay people and then so clearly entrapping them into prostitution, but it's sort of reversed because then this 52-year-old gay man's like all of a sudden being accused of being a prostitute, and he sort of feels like it should probably be the other way around, if anything, if he was going to be entrapped. So that's one of the reasons that I think the New York Police Department messed up about, is because they sort of reversed everything. An investigation in Palm Beach County in 2012 found that in the previous 5 years, the Sheriff's Department arrested over 600 men for soliciting sex in public parks, and they were often approached by the officers themselves and coerced into saying something that then gave the officer a reason to arrest them. In Los Angeles, the LAPD have been arresting gay men for cruising in public parks, beaches, and restrooms as recently as 2013. They're charged with lewd acts in public, loitering, and indecent exposure, and their faces are shown on the local news and in newspapers, effectively ruining their lives, even though they hadn't been convicted of anything. Some gay rights groups actually came to the defense of a lot of these men in Manhattan Beach when they were arrested for loitering in a restroom by the beach, and then the local news showed all their photos on TV, and then the gay rights groups actually were motivated to caring about it, and I think one of the men sued successfully, but since then there hasn't really been talk of the gay cruising stings and that gay people should care about it. And oftentimes when it's reported in the gay press, there's sort of a sense of like, oh, well, these people are doing that, they're bad, the rest of us don't do that. So I think that's really problematic that even among queer people, they're sort of making a divide of good and bad and us versus them. There was a quote that I really liked from a female LAPD sergeant regarding the arrests for cruising in parks that I think shows how estranged the mainstream gay rights movement is from criminal justice issues. This is what she said. "That's what drove a lot of people into these areas to meet up, to hook up, to meet other gay people," she said. "But the times have changed, the laws have changed. It's not illegal simply to be gay anymore. But this segment of the community hasn't quite caught up with the changing of the times." So this is law enforcement telling gay people how to be gay. They're saying that you can't be gay and want to meet men in the way that gay men have been doing for decades. The mainstream gay rights movement towards assimilation has paradoxically given law enforcement a tool that criminalizes queer people further. I also need to point out that men of color, including immigrants and working class people, are disproportionately affected. They can be seen as easy targets and less empathetic, and compounding racism, classism, xenophobia with homophobia and transphobia also. So this is an issue that covers so many communities and affects so many different people that I think it's a good opportunity to build alliances. Another way that queer people are targeted is through HIV criminalization. I'm not sure how much you guys know about that, but the Center for HIV Law and Policy describes it a bit. They say, currently there are 32 states and 2 US territories that explicitly criminalize HIV exposure through sex, shared needles, and in some jurisdictions through bodily fluids, including saliva. In these cases, neither proof of the intent to transmit HIV nor actual transmission is required. Sentences for HIV-positive persons convicted of HIV exposure are typically very harsh and disproportionate to the actual or potential harm presented in the facts of the case, perpetuating the stigma that HIV-positive people are toxic and dangerous. Studies show that these HIV-specific statutes and prosecutions have absolutely no effect on behavior and, in fact, undermine public health goals. HIV criminalization can discourage individuals from seeking testing and treatment because a positive test result subjects a person to criminal liability for otherwise non-criminal conduct. HIV-positive persons increasingly are forced to register as sex offenders after conviction, leading to a host of lifelong problems with future employment, living conditions, and the right to privacy. So even though HIV isn't a gay disease that it's sometimes made out to be, it's still very much an issue in gay and queer communities, especially in communities of color. The history of HIV and AIDS is inextricably linked with queerness, and HIV criminalization can be viewed as an extension of homophobia. There's one recent case that got a lot of press. A black college student is facing a lifetime sentence, for possibly exposing consensual sexual partners to HIV, even though his partners agreed to not use a condom. In this case, it's easy to peg a large gay athlete as a sexually aggressive and deceptive criminal that needs to be locked up, because black gay men in the US are at the highest risk of contracting HIV of any people in the world. Racism is very closely tied with mass incarceration and homophobia, and fuels a desire to criminalize queer people of color. This adds to the already bloated sex offender registries, as we all know, once again showing ways in which the government and law enforcement are using queer people as a means of filling arrest quotas and registries. Another example of criminalization of queer people is the ongoing harassment and imprisonment of transgender populations. Transgender and gender nonconforming people have been at the front lines of gay liberation dating back to the Stonewall riots in 1969, which most of us probably know about and have heard about, yet they're still very much a target for law enforcement. Andrea Richey, who's an advocate for queer youth in New York City, who we had the pleasure of meeting last month in Detroit, she explains how law enforcement sees policing gender roles as part of their work. This is slightly theoretical, but it's very much happening in practice. I think most people are familiar with racial profiling, but I think people are less familiar with how gender is really central to policing in the United States. That includes expectations in terms of how women are supposed to look, how men are supposed to look, how women are supposed to act, and how men are supposed to act. When they see someone who isn't acting in a way that they think they should be acting around gender, or isn't expressing gender in a particular way, or who is visibly someone who is queer or genderqueer or sexually nonconforming, they often read that as disorder, and they often perceive that person as already disorderly, as already suspicious, and as already prone to violence. Transgender people are much more likely to be poor and homeless because of discrimination in jobs, housing, and access to social services. They're subject to intense profiling and harassment with increased exposure to police. This is especially true of juveniles and queer youth, especially trans youth. They're subjected to some of the most horrific police brutality. I mean, the stuff I've read about is really, really horrible when you expect law enforcement to help you out in a situation and you just find out that they're gonna beat you up or worse. Trans people are charged with survival crimes such as sex work due to lack of access to meaningful employment or education. Sometimes transgender people are arrested for using the wrong bathroom, and many trans women are falsely arrested for soliciting sex just because they're profiled as sex workers merely for being trans and walking down the street. They're more likely to be seen as the aggressor in altercations and in instances of sexual violence. Their gender transgression gives law enforcement the power to criminalize their very existence, and because they're stereotyped as hypersexual, they're easy targets for arrest for sex crimes, such as prostitution and sexual assault. And once again, this adds faces and bodies to the registries that we already know are useless and destructive. These are just a few of the ways that queer people are criminalized. There's so many more examples that I can't get into, but there's a trend sort of across identities and across ethnicities that this is an issue that we really need to combine and bring awareness to. So with that, I'm going to bring it off to Galen.
Andrew ended talking about trends, and I'm tackling a really challenging aspect of this problem, which is more than just trends, but what's operating those trends? What are the underlying guiding principles in our social fabric that perpetuate homophobia as expressions through our criminal justice system? So I'll just pose you that question and I'll sit down now, because talking about this is challenging. It's rough. And the reason it's rough is because homophobia now has been, it's become an undertone. It's not overt anymore because it's not permitted socially to be overtly expressed. So I'll start, I guess, by contradicting myself. When I was 19, I was locked up. I was a college student. I was doing really great. And when I had my sentencing event, the man who had trapped me came and testified to what a nasty, evil individual I was. I didn't know me. And he was a professional predator. So his job was to go out and trick kids like me into breaking the law. And so I broke the law by sending pictures to a 14-year-old kid, except for I didn't. And I never would have. I sent pictures to a 50-something-year-old man whose job it was to manipulate me into a situation that I would break the law. Now, we all know it's probably called entrapment. A lot of you probably also understand that entrapment is more or less just a word now, even though it's illegal in many states. The cops get away with it all the time as a matter of business. So there I was sitting at my sentencing, and my lawyers asked the guy, well, why did you do this to Galen? What was the probable cause? What had he done wrong? And the man's answer was, well, Galen was a gay man talking to a child. So I got to sit in the courtroom and hear that my life had been destroyed because I was a 19-year-old and I had a friend who was a younger teenager. That's it. His mom didn't like the fact that he was talking to an older gay teenager. That's why I went to prison. That's how I got set up by the government, by my government. So sometimes it does take overt forms, and that those overt forms, while they may be rare in the system, I think that they serve as a guiding post to something that functions in a much more subtle way generally. So what I want to talk about is what are the prevailing myths in our society that perpetuate homophobia in our criminal justice system, and how do they express themselves in the criminal justice system itself? So if we can't say that we don't like you because you're gay, but we want to make sure that you go to prison for twice as long as the straight kid, how do we go about doing that? And when I was sitting in a solitary confinement a couple of months before I ultimately won a trial that gave me my freedom, I got this book in the mail. It was by Roger Lancaster. It's called Sex, Panic, and the Punitive State. Some of you have probably read it. It's pretty dense. It's really theoretical. Dr. Lancaster is a professor at George Mason University, and he's a cultural anthropologist. So what he's done is study how the history of sex panic in the United States has evolved and shifted into different forms. So some of you in the audience today were around when being gay was not okay. That was still somewhat the case in the early 2000s when I was in college, or definitely in the 90s when I was in high school. But back in the 70s or the 60s, it was an entirely different world. So people were overtly targeted for being gay. And because, as a group, there was such a great fear of being public about your identity, they're perpetuated even more myths and negative sentiment toward this population because people didn't feel like they knew them, they didn't recognize them. So what happened? Well, Harvey Milk happened, people started coming out of the closet, and all of a sudden there was this growing recognition that gayness wasn't inherently otherness. They were just human beings. And in fact, they were your brother-in-law, they were your nephew, they were maybe your son or your dad. So people started to recognize that this wasn't some alien population. These were people that they actually knew, and that their behaviors and society's bigotry was harming directly people that they had experienced. And so that moved society in a different direction. And we've had a great deal of progress over the last several decades gaining gay rights. So that begins to move us into the sex offender field. Because what's happened, essentially, as Roger Lancaster describes far more eloquently than I will today, is that we've begun to react to the gay liberation movement. And it's not just that. There was a feminist movement, too. So there have been these foundational changes in power structures in our society. And that makes a lot of people insecure.